Well, greetings and salutations, everyone, and welcome back to today's second half. Before we get into it, a couple links. As you know, I rely on Patreon, PayPal, and my merch to help the channel to continue to grow and go. The links to Patreon and PayPal are in the description below, my merch displayed directly under the video. Also, Dogman, Frightening Encounters, Volume 1, 2, and 3, the audiobook versions. They were written and researched by Tom Lyons, narrated and produced by me, Jeffrey Nadolny. Those audiobooks are available on Audible, Amazon, and iTunes, the links to which are also in the description as well. And finally, last but definitely not least, if you'd really like to help this channel to continue to grow and go, simply subscribe, click the like button, and comment, because honestly, it all does help. Now, everyone, I have taken far too much of your time. Let's get on with today's second half. Shall we? Wow, first and foremost, I'd like to thank everybody for sticking by me during that illness. That was terrible, and I apologize for my vocal oh, my lord. Feeling 100% better, actually. Today I went and I had planted some rhododendron that I had gotten my mom for Mother's Day. 3 bushes and an oak tree. And I think being outside, sweating, really kind of polished off the last little bit of what was kicking my butt. So I'm back 100%. And thank you for sticking by me. Also, super excited, on May 25th, I will be on the Sean Atwood Unleashed, discussing these unknown, unsolved animal attacks in America. And I am super excited about that. I am honored that he invited me onto his show. He apparently has him and Ash checked out the channel, and I guess I'm up to their par. So thank you, Sean and Ash, for the invite, and I am looking forward to it. Tonight I have some terrifying, just flat out terrifying encounters to share with you. So let's get into these. Today's first encounter. I grew up in the small foothills of eastern Kentucky in a place called Bailey's Creek in Harlan County, where folklore and stories of haunts and mountain monsters ran rampant. Everyone has a cousin or an uncle that saw Bigfoot while out hunting, or an aunt that swears she saw a ghost in her old high school at one time, so it's hard to discern what is truth and what is fiction. Most of what I've personally seen or heard while out in the mountains, I usually attribute to local wildlife. Have I seen anything that is unexplainable in my logical mind? Not yet. But I'm also not arrogant enough to think that these things don't exist. I saw someone earlier that said it perfectly. 90% of these stories are fiction, but it's the 10% that really leaves you wondering. By logic, we have to assume that 10% of these stories are true, and that those people witnessed something amazing and terrifying. In my small town, Dogman is a known perpetrator of many unfortunate happenings. I've heard stories of it killing chickens, trying to bust down doors, attacking hikers, or just being a nuisance on someone's farm or property. I've also heard stories of it stalking those that live deep in the woods, coming to stare into their windows at night, and even protecting them from strangers that made their way onto their land at some point. The majority of these people like to tell booger stories, as we say. They like having a grand story to tell people, for attention or just the pleasure of telling it. I'm not sure which. But a few are trustworthy, and they are usually the ones that will only tell their tale if asked. My grandfather was one of them. Yeah, I know it sounds biased because it's my granddad, but I have 6 uncles and an aunt that literally could make a living out of the lies they tell about the local cryptids. And I'm more than happy to call them liars. My grandfather, though, is a very logical man. He was a skeptic in everything cryptid, as well as spirits and ghosts, always looking for a logical explanation, and usually upsetting the storyteller as well by questioning everything. That's why I tend to believe him, because he never tried to lie to me or his other grandkids. If anything, he was always the voice of reason we ran to when we were scared. But once, when I was younger, I asked him if he had ever seen anything before, be it a ghost or a monster. I'd been hearing stories from my uncles all day about Bigfoot, haunts, etc., and wanted to know his thoughts on it. He sat there for a moment, not even really acknowledging my question. And when I was about to ask again, just in case he hadn't heard me, he spoke up. When he and my grandmother had first bought our family homestead, they had heard fantastical stories about monsters that roamed that part of the mountains and how evil they were. My grandmother was a little scared, but my grandfather said he just shook his head and went on. He figured it was a few black bears that people had been hearing and seeing, or even some bobcat, and that he wasn't too worried about it. About 2 months into them living there, sure enough, he had seen a mama bear and some cubs making their way up the mountain behind the house, so he didn't think much to it when he heard something pounding on his front door one night, scratching at it and trying to get in. He told me that he had grabbed his shotgun before going to the door. He tried to look out the front window to see if he could catch a glimpse of whatever or whoever was there, but he could only see a large black shadow being cast on the porch. Being the fearless soul that he was, he unlocked the door and swung it open, expecting a bear or even a person standing there. It was neither. What he saw that night still had him shook up when he told me his story, and this was some 50 years later. He said he had swung the door open, and he saw an extremely large humanoid standing there. It stood a good 6.5 feet tall, slightly hunched over as it stood on the covered porch. Its arms were long, hands reaching past its bent knees, which were bending in the opposite direction of a human. He said that it was covered in a thick black hair, very dense and dark, and that it had a smell to it. It was a mix between wet dog and raw sewage. Lastly, the face, or rather the head, was what brought him up short. He said it looked like a German shepherd's head had been placed on a large, hairy, human-shaped body, and that as he looked at it, it cocked its head sideways and looked back down at him, its eyes showing fear and confusion. He told me that he had pulled his gun up, and before his finger could hit the trigger, it took off, but not before he got off a warning shot right in its right calf muscle. He said the howl that came out of that thing when he shot it scared him more than anything in his life, and he ran back inside, bolting the door closed. He stood there listening as cries and howls began to fade as it ran deeper into the mountains, only he couldn't hear it anymore before he moved away from the door and went back to the bedroom. And he swore to me on all things that he had held dear in his life that this thing would sometimes show up, dragging its wounded leg across his porch as it came to the door, but it never bothered anything again. He said it would come up to the door, sniff around, before it softly growled and took off again. He told me that there are a lot of things in the woods that can hurt you, be it a beast or a plant, and a lot more that can scare you. But the thing he saw that night was the scariest of all, and that I'd best never go looking for it, because I would woefully regret it. My granddad's been gone 15 years now, and I still believe every word he told me to that day. Does that prove the existence of such a creature? Maybe not. and the words of an old war vet wouldn't be enough to change the minds of some people. But to me, it's the realest story I've ever heard about the creature. I hope that someday someone can get some actual documented proof, if only to prove what my grandfather went through and what he saw that night. And that right there, my friends, is an encounter that, I would love to be able to find an old timer like that. And I've said it before on the channel, and I've said it to people that I talk to sometimes. Hey, I'd love to just go out in the sticks, whether it's north, south, east, west, wherever. Find an old timer, sit down on their porch with them, and just kind of chew the fat with them. Doesn't need to be a male or a female. It could be whoever's willing to talk to me. And, just pick their brains and see what they have to say about these creatures in the times past. Definitely a very interesting and cool experience. Today's second encounter. I already know there are no skinwalkers in the Appalachian Mountains, but I'm hoping someone can shed some light on this stuff because it's really starting to freak me out. So my family has owned this lot of land in Hiawassee, Georgia since the 80s, and my dad and his family would take vacations up there. It's completely secluded from any form of city or other life. You have to drive at least 2 miles on a gravel road to reach another house. Tight, narrow woods all around. A few more houses have sprung up since I was a child, and it's made it less scary to stay there. Anyway, this entire experience starts from all the way back to where my dad was staying there. The place was a simple trailer across the gravel road led straight up to the mountain the trailer was on. My dad would go up on that mountain and sit sometimes. He told me an experience one time when he was sitting up there. When he was a teenager, he had heard heavy cracking, something that sounded identical to a human, but he remembered this was far away from any other houses. This was basically his land. He said first the cracking came from behind him. Then next thing it was in front of him. He stood up and screamed, "Get the F out of here!" And he said the footsteps disappeared. He didn't hear anything walk off. Footsteps that sounded right behind and in front of him just vanished. They were gone. He sprinted home and was terrified to go back out in the woods that day. Now it's my turn to go on the mountain. He didn't tell me his experience until after. I'm with a buddy, and Netflix had just added that download movies to watch later thing on their app. But the trailer has literally no service. Zero service at all. My dad says maybe we can walk to the top, and because there are less trees, we'll get good enough reception. We end up climbing it and get to the top, and the same thing that happened to my dad starts happening. First footsteps that sound heavy behind us, and then in front of us. But then, it starts to sound like we're being surrounded. We're terrified. We hear turkey gobbles far away, which in retrospect was weird because the footsteps sounded closer and heavier than a turkey. And so our nerves are eased just for a second because us teenagers could take a flock of turkeys. But then, what sounded like right in front of the trees, we heard a voice say, "Hey." It sounded almost like my dad. Almost like it, but different version, like slightly more nasally maybe. I didn't have time to really process that it was my dad's voice at that moment. I was really just thinking someone said "hey" in front of me, and rural Georgia, after hearing surrounding footsteps all around me, we both booked it down the hill, back to the trailer, not really telling if there were footsteps following us or not. True fight or flight situation. It wasn't until we got back that my friend said, "Did you hear the voice too? Didn't it sound like your dad a little bit?" My mind was racing. I ran inside the trailer to see if my dad was inside. Sure enough, he was. I asked him if he had went up to the top of the mountain, and he didn't. Thinking better, it made no sense for the voice to come from in front of us, since He could have only been behind us. I told him what we had heard, and that's when he told me his story of what happened to him when he was a teenager. He didn't know anything about skinwalkers or, cryptids any of the time, but I had the internet and had always wondered what I had heard. Another experience from the same place. The living room is basically surrounded by windows. I always hated it because we didn't have blinds or curtains on all of them. And I always got the sense that someone or something was watching me at one point or another. Side note, also, this place has always creeped me out. I was genuinely terrified to stay there no matter what. I never wanted to go when I was a kid. Okay, continuing. One night as a kid, I saw a shadow in the blinds of something probably just slightly shorter than the entire trailer walking outside on two legs. And very skinny in some parts. My parents made me sleep in the living room sofa a lot. On the outside of the house, there were lamps, which were always turned on. And we had our own one orange street light. The vision of it walking from in front of me to literally behind me. The only thing separating me from it was a window that the couch was against. I was frozen with fear. It's literally something you'd never want to experience again, and is trauma-inducing. Your heart was racing. Every hair on my body was standing up, and not knowing whether you should close your eyes and wait to die or stare and just hope it goes away. It ended up walking past the window and didn't come back into my view. Thankfully, it only walked past two windows with curtains. I could have died that night. I have a relatively small experience that just one time, while we were fishing near a creek near our place, we had various rocks and sticks thrown at us, but we brushed it off as fallen limbs and stuff rolling downhill or something. But now I wonder if it was something much more. Today's third experience. My parents were out of town. I lived in a small neighborhood in upstate New York. My backyard was half cleared land and half dense wood. There's a small creek that runs behind my house. You could see all sorts of animals at night, including turkey, fox, possum, raccoons, and deer. One night, around 1 a.m, I was on the couch in the extended living room part of the house, where 3 of the walls had windows and we had a skylight. This is important because I had a complete view of almost all of my backyard up to the tree's edge, including the moon overhead, which was a waning crescent. I heard the sound of a very angry squirrel for about 5 minutes, and I'm kind of brushing it off because I've heard angry squirrels before. Then I heard the most terrifying screech. It sounded like a goose had just been murdered and screaming. It scared the crap out of me, and I immediately rushed over to the windows to see if I could see anything. I was worried it might have been a wolf, since my neighbor's cat goes wandering outside and usually kills a bunny or two and leaves them in our front yard. It was pitch black, and my porch light barely illuminated anything but our backyard. I brushed off the noise and went to bed shortly thereafter. The next morning I headed over to my neighbor's house, who has hunted before and occasionally would bow hunt as well. I asked him if he heard that noise last night, and he said, yeah, they thought it was a deer crying for help. They told me they were going to investigate the woods in a few hours to see what had happened. I was reluctant to ask to go, but I was determined to know what the noise was. A few hours later, my neighbors and I went into the woods. We didn't have to go far when we saw a dead squirrel pretty much ripped to shreds. We continued on, figuring that squirrels don't have much meat on them, so the animal probably tried to get as much as it could out of it. We wandered for about 5 more minutes when we came across 5 dead rabbits, a deer, her fawn, and a dead goose. Now, this frightened me the most. 3 of the dead rabbits had just their heads missing, and their body was intact. The other 2 were ripped to shreds, similar to the squirrel. I almost gagged at the smell of this all. I didn't dare walk toward the goose or the deer. My neighbor, who had a bow on him, walked towards the mother deer to see if She had long claw marks on her torso, and her head had been mangled. The fawn, however, had its head missing as well. Now, the weirdest part of all the dead animals was the goose. The goose was fully intact, except its lungs had been ripped out, and all the interior organs were gone. My neighbor's wife immediately called the police and said there was possibly a bear roaming the property and attacking animals. I had my suspicions, but I didn't believe this was a bear. My neighbor, who had the bow, was keeping a close eye on the surrounding woods, like he was watching for something. His wife paid no attention to this and continued to talk to the police. Then it hit me, the feeling of dread and chills. New York gets cold in the morning, but this was summer and the humidity is usually around 90%. The entire woods seemed to be silent as well. We were near a creek and couldn't hear the water flowing either. I could see my neighbor had that same feeling wash over him as he raised his bow and loaded an arrow onto it. He told his wife to be quiet and for me to stand back. I couldn't see anything, but that feeling was still with me. My neighbor, I know, saw something, but refused to tell me what it was since I was 15 and he probably didn't want to scare me. After a few moments, the feeling of dread was gone and the sound of something moving through the forest could be heard in the distance. My neighbor lowered the bow and told us we had to leave. We immediately listened, and by the time we got back to the neighborhood, the town police had arrived. My neighbor explained the story to the police, and they advised us to stay inside. They later sent a few animal control people to survey the area and try to get the bear away from the neighborhood. Well, they came back empty-handed. I never knew what was out there. I've done some research. I feel it might have been a Dogman by the dead animals. My neighbor refused to talk to me about it ever again, and my neighbor, who had the bow, seemed very cautious after that. This happened a few years ago. I now live in a different state. I've never told anyone about this because I thought I was overthinking it, which I do a lot. Overanalyzing is my kind of thing. I don't have any contact with the neighbor anymore either. For anyone wondering, my neighbor had moved to this bigger piece of land because he had hoped to bow hunt on his own property so he could stand up in the trees. As far as I know, New York State deemed it that it was still a form of hunting, and later the town police told him he couldn't do that anymore. Wow, some terrifying encounters right there, especially that one from New York. Man, that just, as I was reading that, I was thinking about that poor woman, Megan Moran, who I was talking about earlier today, and how she just mysteriously vanished. And it really doesn't make any sense. I read some comments in the comment section. One guy was like focused on the statement that I had made, how it said that she had touched many students' lives. And people are real creeps. It was a statement. It kind of irked me because she had touched a lot of kids' lives, and then the guy made the statement like she had done something wrong, and now she was on the run. I really dislike people like that, and you know what? I blocked them. So, I really feel terrible for that family. But anyway, I started thinking about this experience here. My experiences like Tom Mezek, and I don't think we're going to find this poor woman. I really don't. And if they do, they're probably going to find her in pieces, which really does suck for the family. Anyway, maybe they do and maybe they don't. I hope they do and get some closure for this poor family. With that, my friends, stay safe. May the Great Spirit watch over us all, and may He guide us through that path that we call life.